Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing chapters of frontier justice in American history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will haunt you in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that destroyed an entire community, where a punishment so barbaric was enacted that it erased a town from the map and left a legacy so dark that for over a century, historians refused to acknowledge it ever happened. It was the year 1893. The Chicago World's Fair was dazzling millions with its white city, showcasing humanity's technological triumph. Electric lights, the first Ferris wheel, a celebration of progress and civilization. But in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, in a settlement that maps would soon forget, the situation was entirely different. There, civilization had a different face, a harder face, one carved by isolation, poverty, and a justice system that operated by rules the outside world had long abandoned. The town was called Harrow's Creek. You won't find it on modern maps. You won't find it in county histories. The name itself has been scrubbed from official records with such thoroughness that researchers began to believe it was nothing more than folklore, a cautionary tale told around Appalachian campfires to frighten children into obedience. But Harrow's Creek was real. And what happened there in the autumn of 1893 was so horrifying that the Commonwealth of Kentucky itself intervened to ensure the town's complete erasure. This is the story of a punishment that should never have been carried out, a sentence that violated every principle of civilized justice, and a community that chose collective silence over collective guilt, disappearing into the mountains rather than face what they had done. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from fragments, a diary discovered in an attic in 1967. Court records that were misfiled and forgotten, deathbed confessions recorded by a local minister, and the testimony of one woman who survived to tell what she witnessed, though she waited 40 years before she could speak the words aloud. This is the story of how a town buried a man alive, and how that man's screams from beneath the earth destroyed everything those townspeople thought they knew about justice, mercy, and themselves. To understand what happened in Harrow's Creek, you must first understand the place itself, not just its location, but its soul. The way geography shapes human behavior, the way mountains can isolate not just bodies, but minds. Eastern Kentucky in the 1890s was a world unto itself. Vast stretches of the Appalachian Mountains, rising like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in mist that rarely lifted even in high summer. Valleys so deep and narrow that sunlight reached the bottom for only a few hours each day. Forests so dense that a person could walk for days without finding a trail, where the canopy grew so thick that even at noon, the light filtering through was green and submarine, creating the sensation of being underwater. Harrow's Creek sat in one of these valleys. A settlement of perhaps 200 souls, carved into existence by families who had fled civilization seeking either freedom or anonymity, often both. The town consisted of a single dirt road that ran alongside the creek for which it was named, a waterway that flowed year-round, fed by springs deep in the mountain. On either side of this road stood rough, hewn structures, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a small Baptist church with a bell that rang only for deaths and Sundays, and perhaps 40 cabins scattered up the hillsides like seeds thrown by careless hands. The people of Harrow's Creek were connected by blood and marriage in ways that made the community simultaneously unified and fractious. Everyone was someone's cousin. Every slight was remembered. Every debt, whether of money or honor, was recorded in the ledger of collective memory. They lived by hunting, by small lot farming on hillsides so steep that plowing required ropes to keep the mules from tumbling, and by making whiskey in hidden stills that dotted the mountains like secret shrines. The whiskey was their currency, their medicine, their comfort, and their curse. The outside world reached them rarely. A circuit judge might arrive twice a year. A peddler would brave the treacherous trails every few months. Occasionally, a preacher from Lexington or Louisville would venture into the mountains to save souls, though most left convinced the mountains had claimed those souls long ago. In this isolation, law took on a different meaning. There was no sheriff, no jail, no courthouse. Justice was administered by the town council, a group of 5 elders chosen not by election but by consensus, men whose authority derived from age, respect, and the simple fact that they owned most land and could read. Their word was final, their punishments were swift, and in the autumn of 1893, their judgment would prove catastrophic. Life in Harrow's Creek followed rhythms established generations earlier. Men rose before dawn to work the fields or hunt. Women tended gardens, preserved food, bore children with the assistance of midwives who worked with herbs and prayers in equal measure. Children were assets, extra hands for planting and harvest. And childhood was brief, ending at 13 or 14, when young bodies were strong enough for adult labor. Education was sporadic. A schoolhouse existed, but it operated only when someone with basic literacy agreed to teach, and only when children could be spared from work. Most residents signed their names with an X. The Bible was the only book many families owned, and even then, it was often more talisman than text. Religion infused everything, but it was a harsh religion, one that emphasized judgment over mercy, damnation over salvation. The God worshipped in the little Baptist church was an Old Testament God who demanded sacrifice, who tested faith with suffering, who divided humanity into the saved and the damned with no middle ground. Reverend Josiah Kane presided over spiritual matters. He was a tall man, gaunt as a scarecrow, with eyes that burned with an intensity some called divine inspiration, and others called something darker. He had arrived in Harrow's Creek in 1886, claiming God had called him to minister to the forgotten. He preached sermons that could last 3 hours, his voice rising and falling like a tempest, speaking of hellfire and eternal torment with such vivid detail that children had nightmares and adults emerged from services pale and shaking. But Kane was more than a preacher. He sat on the town council, and his interpretations of divine justice heavily influenced earthly punishments. The 5 men who composed the town council in 1893 were Silas Harrow, 70, 2 years old, the town's founder's eldest son. He owned the general store and the gristmill. His word carried the weight of lineage. He was hard of hearing, which made him rely heavily on the opinions of others during deliberations. Josiah Kane, the preacher, 40, 9 years old, the only council member who could quote scripture from memory and use it to justify any decision. Nathaniel Rooker, 60, 1 years old, a former Confederate soldier who had fled Tennessee after the war. He owned the largest farm and employed a dozen men. He believed in harsh discipline and saw mercy as weakness. Elijah Sutter, 50, 8 years old, the blacksmith, a man of few words who believed problems should be solved with finality. Once a decision was made, it was carved in stone. Thomas Wickham, 50, 3 years old, the youngest council member. He kept the town's records in a leather-bound ledger. He was the only one who occasionally questioned whether their justice aligned with actual law, though he never pressed his concerns far enough to cause real conflict. These 5 men held absolute power over their isolated domain. They settled disputes, assigned punishments, and made decisions that would ripple through generations. In October of 1893, they would make a decision that would end their world. His name was Marcus Brennan, 27 years old. Tightly to a NEWCOM, ER to INT, UITIVEP, ICTURE, Paros Cancipriac, having arrived only 2 years earlier from somewhere farther south. He'd never been specific about his origins, which immediately made him suspect. He worked as a hired hand, moving from farm to farm, never staying long enough to put down roots, but present enough to become familiar. Marcus was handsome in a way that made men distrust him, and made women look twice when their husbands weren't watching. Dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, sharp blue eyes that seemed to see more than they should, a smile that could charm or mock depending on his mood. He was different. He didn't attend church regularly. He asked questions about things that everyone else simply accepted. He laughed too loudly and drank too freely. In a community built on conformity and rigid social structures, Marcus Brennan was an irritant, a foreign substance that the social body couldn't quite expel, but couldn't absorb either. But being different wasn't a crime. What happened on the night of October 12, 1893, was. According to the testimony later recorded by Thomas Wickham, Marcus Brennan entered the home of William and Sarah Hobbs while William was away hunting. What happened inside that cabin became a matter of dispute that would never be fully resolved. Sarah Hobbs was 24 years old. She had been married to William for 6 years and had borne him 3 children, 2 of whom survived. She was known as a quiet woman, devout, obedient to her husband in all things, the model of what women in Harrow's Creek were expected to be. When William returned 3 days later from his hunting trip, he found his wife changed. The details of what she told him remain unclear, filtered through generations of shame and silence. But the essence was this: Marcus Brennan had forced himself upon her. The word used in the records was violation. The reality it represented was too terrible for more explicit language. In communities like Harrow's Creek, such accusations were rare not because such crimes didn't occur, but because speaking of them was seen as bringing shame upon the victim's entire family. For Sarah to have spoken at all meant something profound had broken inside her, either genuine trauma beyond her ability to contain, or something else entirely. William Hobbs went directly to the town council. Marcus Brennan was arrested, if such a formal word can be used for what actually happened. 4 men, including Nathaniel Rooker and his sons, went to the boarding house where Marcus rented a room and dragged him out at gunpoint. LOC high KED him in IPR, route, FI, LE cellar beneath the general store, the closest thing Harrow's Creek had to a jail. What followed was a mockery of justice, though the people of Harrow's Creek didn't see it that way. They saw it as efficiency, as righteous judgment, as the will of God made manifest through his chosen representatives. The town council convened the next morning in the church. The entire population of Harrow's Creek crowded inside, packing the pews, standing along the walls, pressing faces against windows to witness what everyone knew would be a reckoning. Marcus Brennan was brought in with his hands still bound. His face bore bruises from the previous night resisting arrest. The men who captured him claimed, though several witnesses would later say, he'd offered no resistance at all. He was not given a lawyer. There were no lawyers in Harrow's Creek. He was not read his rights. Most people there couldn't have listed what those rights were. He was not allowed to call witnesses in his defense. The council would hear from Sarah Hobbs and from anyone who had information relevant to the charge. Then they would render judgment. Sarah Hobbs testified first. She sat in a wooden chair before the council, her head bowed, her voice barely above a whisper. Reverend Kane had to ask her several times to speak louder so the assembly could hear. According to the fragmented accounts that survive, her testimony was halting and vague. She said Marcus had come to her door asking for water. She had invited him in, a kindness she now regretted. He had, she couldn't say the words, she wept. She said he had taken something from her that couldn't be returned. Reverend Cain spoke extensively about sin, about the serpent in Eden, about men who let their base natures rule their actions. Marcus Brennan was then allowed to speak. He denied everything. He said he had visited the Hobbs cabin, yes, but only briefly, and Sarah had given him water willingly. Nothing improper had occurred, he suggested, and this was his fatal error, that perhaps Sarah had invited him and now regretted it. Perhaps her husband had noticed something, and this accusation was a way to protect herself. The reaction was immediate and violent. William Hobbs lunged toward Marcus, restrained only by the men sitting nearest to him. Women gasped. Someone shouted that Marcus was calling Sarah a liar and a whore, though he'd said no such thing explicitly. Nathaniel Rooker stood and declared that any man who would violate a woman and then impugn her character deserved not just death, but a death that would serve as a warning to anyone who might harbor. Similar thoughts. Silas Harrow, the eldest, nodded slowly. Thomas Wickham, the record keeper, asked if they shouldn't perhaps send word to the county seat, let proper authorities handle this. Reverend Cain responded with a 15-minute sermon about how Harrow's Creek was beyond the reach of corrupt worldly law, how God had placed them in this valley precisely so they could administer pure justice untainted by the compromises and legalities that let guilty men escape punishment. The vote was called. Guilty, unanimous, sentence, death, but not just death. Elijah Sutter, the blacksmith, proposed something else. Something that would ensure the punishment matched the crime's severity. Something that would be remembered. He proposed they bury Marcus Brennan alive. Reverend Cain stood before the congregation with his Bible open, his finger tracing lines of Scripture as he built his theological case for what they were about to do. The earth opened her mouth. He read, his voice echoing off the church's rough timber walls, and swallowed them up, and their houses, and all the men that appertained unto Korah, and all their goods. They, and all that appertained to them, went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed upon them, and they perished from among the congregation. Numbers chapter 16. The story of Korah's rebellion, God's judgment enacted through the earth itself. The ground shall cleave asunder. Cain continued, and swallow the wicked. This is not our justice. This is divine justice. We are but instruments. He spoke of other precedents, of how ancient peoples had buried criminals alive as the ultimate punishment, of how it was fitting that those who violated the sacred should be returned to the earth in a manner that mirrored their return to dust, but accelerated, conscious, deserving. Thomas Wickham raised an objection. The law doesn't permit. What law? Nathaniel Rooker interrupted. The law that's 2 days' ride from here, the law that wouldn't arrive until spring. We are the law. We've always been the law. But to bury a man breathing. He took Sarah's life from her. Rooker said, not her breath, but her life nonetheless. She'll carry this shame forever. Her children will whisper about it. Her husband will never look at her the same. He's killed her in every way, but physical, so let him know what it is to feel life slipping away, inch by inch, breath by breath. The vote was taken again. For the proposed method of execution, 4 in favor. Thomas Wickham abstained. The sentence would be carried out the following day at sunset. That night, several men dug the grave, not in the churchyard cemetery. That ground was consecrated, meant only for the righteous. Instead, they chose a location a quarter-mile outside town, on a bare hillside where nothing grew, where the soil was hard clay mixed with rock. They dug deep, 6 feet, the traditional depth, but this grave was different. It was wider than most, 7 feet by 3 feet. And they dug it with a specific purpose. They wanted enough room that Marcus Brennan would be able to move. Slightly, this wasn't meant to be instant suffocation. This was meant to be experienced. At the bottom of the grave, they placed a wooden box, roughly constructed from pine boards. The box was barely larger than a coffin, but it wasn't sealed. The top was a separate piece, a lid that would rest on the box but not be nailed down. Not yet. Inside the box, they placed a small tin cup of water and a piece of bread. Mercy, they called it. Reverend Kane insisted on this. They weren't monsters, after all. They were Christians carrying out righteous judgment. The condemned man would have sustenance. Whether he chose to consume it in his final hours was between him and God. They also drove a hollow reed, a thin metal tube about the width of a finger, down through the earth from the surface to where the box would sit. This would allow air to reach the condemned man for a while, until the tube became clogged with earth, or until rain filled it with water, or until time and pressure collapsed it. How long that would take, no one could say. Days, perhaps, maybe a week, long enough. In the root cellar beneath the general store, Marcus Brennan spent his last night above ground. According to a diary entry found decades later, written by Clara Henshaw, who was 16 at the time and whose father owned the store, she snuck down to the cellar around midnight to bring Marcus water. Her entry, dated October 13, 1893, reads, "Father would beat me if he knew I'd gone to the cellar, but I couldn't help myself. I had to see if the man they're going to bury is truly a monster like Reverend Kane says. I expected to find a beast. I found a man terrified beyond speech. He couldn't stop shaking. When I gave him the water, he wept and asked me to tell his sister in Nashville what happened. He said her name 3 times, Margaret, 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 like a prayer. He said he was innocent. He said Sarah Hobbs had invited his company, and now she was afraid her husband would discover it. I don't know if I believe him. I don't know anything anymore. All I know is that tomorrow they're going to put him in the ground breathing, and nobody seems to think this is wrong except me and maybe Mr. Wickham, who won't speak up. God forgive us all." The entry continues, but the handwriting becomes erratic, suggesting Clara wrote through tears. She did give Marcus water. She also gave him a small Bible, though he couldn't read. She never told anyone about her visit until she was an old woman, dying, when she confessed it to her grandson, who recorded her words. October 14, 1893. The day dawned gray and cold, appropriate for what was to come. The entire population of Harrow's Creek gathered at the execution site as sunset approached. This wasn't optional. Reverend Kane had made it clear that all must witness God's justice. Children, women, everyone. Marcus Brennan was brought from the cellar just as the sun touched the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. His hands were bound behind his back. His legs were shackled with chains that allowed him to shuffle but not run. He looked, according to multiple accounts, like a man already dead. His face had gone pale, almost translucent. His eyes were vacant, staring at nothing. He'd stopped protesting his innocence. He'd stopped speaking entirely. The procession moved slowly up the hillside. Marcus, flanked by Nathaniel Rooker and 2 of his sons. Behind them, the town council. Then the congregation, a dark mass of humanity moving like a funeral cortege. At the grave, Marcus was forced to look down into the hole to see the box waiting at the bottom. Reverend Kane spoke. A long sermon about sin and consequences, about justice and mercy, about how what they were doing was difficult but necessary, how they took no pleasure in it, but how God demanded it. He offered Marcus one final chance to confess. Marcus looked up at him, and according to Thomas Wickham's account, he said only this: "I already told you the truth. You chose not to believe it. So do what you're going to do, and may God judge between us." Those were his last words as a free man. They lowered him into the grave, into the box. He didn't resist. What would have been the point? The box was barely long enough for him to lie flat. Wide enough that he could turn on his side if he needed to, but not much more. The lid was placed over him, and through the gaps in the boards, he could see the sky, see the faces looking down. He could see Sarah Hobbs, standing at the back of the crowd, her face expressionless. He could see Clara Henshaw, who was crying, and whose father slapped her and told her to compose herself. He could see the first shovel of earth rise into the air, and then begin its descent. The sound of earth hitting wood is distinct. A hollow thump, heavy, final. The first shovel full fell on the lid of the box with a sound that made several women turn away. The second followed, then a third. Marcus didn't scream, not at first. The men shoveling were efficient. This was, after all, a community that buried its dead regularly. They knew how to fill a grave. But this time they worked in silence. None of the usual conversation or dark jokes that sometimes accompanied such labor. The earth accumulated quickly, first covering the lid, then rising up the sides of the grave. Within 20 minutes, a foot of soil covered the box. That's when the screaming started, muffled at first, barely audible, but as more people fell silent to listen, it became clear. A voice from beneath the earth, crying out, not words, just sounds, terror made manifest in human vocal cords. Some of the children started crying. Parents held them tighter, or sent them home with older siblings. The screaming continued as the grave was filled. 30 minutes, 45, the hole was 2/3 full when the voice beneath suddenly grew louder, more desperate. He was realizing, perhaps, that this was truly happening, that they weren't going to stop, that his last sight of sky had already passed. Several people vomited. They left the gathering, disappeared into the growing darkness, but most stayed. Witnessed, because Reverend Kane had said they must, because turning away would be admitting doubt. And doubt was dangerous. When the grave was filled completely, the screaming was still audible, faint, distorted by earth, but there, the men packed down the soil, tamped it firm, then they piled rocks on top, marking the grave not with a cross, but with stones arranged in a circle. A warning, not a memorial. Reverend Kane led a prayer. He thanked God for the strength to carry out difficult justice. He asked for the souls of the congregation to remain pure. He asked that Marcus Brennan find redemption in his suffering. The congregation said Amen, and from beneath their feet, very faintly, a scream. The people of Harrow's Creek tried to return to normal life. They failed because the screaming didn't stop. The first night, people in their cabins could hear it, faint but unmistakable, a sound that came from the earth itself, a cry that traveled through stone and soil and entered homes through floors and foundations. Parents told children it was the wind, but everyone knew. The second day, several men approached the town council. They asked if perhaps mercy might be appropriate, if perhaps they could end it quickly. Nathaniel Rooker refused. He made Sarah Hobbs suffer. Let him suffer. God will take him when God decides. The second night was worse. The screaming changed. It became less human, more animal, the sound of a mind breaking. Some people moved their families to the far side of town, as far from the burial site as possible. But the acoustics of the valley were strange. The sound carried. On the third day, Thomas Wickham went to the grave alone. He stood there for an hour, listening. The screaming had become weaker, intermittent. Sometimes minutes would pass in silence, and hope would rise that it was finally over. Then it would start again. Wickham returned and confronted the council. "This is wrong," he said. "We've become murderers, worse than murderers, we're torturers." "He's a rapist," Rooker said. "We don't know that," Wickham replied. "We had a woman's word and a man's denial. We had no witnesses, no evidence. We convicted him because we wanted to believe her, and because he was an outsider." "Are you calling Sarah Hobbs a liar?" Reverend Kane's voice was dangerous. "I'm saying we should have been certain. And we weren't. And now a man is dying in a way that violates every principle of enough." Silas Harrow's voice, weak with age but still carrying authority. "The decision is made. We don't undo what God has ordained." But God, it seemed, had other plans. On the fourth day the weather changed. Dark clouds rolled in from the west, moving fast, hanging low. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. By noon, the first drops of rain began to fall. By evening, it was a deluge. Rain like the valley hadn't seen in years. Torrential, relentless, the kind of rain that turned the creek into a river and the road into a streaming mess. The kind of rain that made people seal windows and pray their roofs would hold. The rain filled the breathing tube they'd driven into the grave. The screaming stopped, finally, but the storm didn't. It rained for 3 days straight, and on the third day of the storm, the 6th day after the burial, something happened that would change everything. The hillside where they'd buried Marcus Brennan began to move. Erosion. Simple, terrible erosion. The hillside was bare rock and hard clay. When the rain came, it had nowhere to go. The water ran in sheets down the slope, carving channels, undermining the packed earth of the grave. Several men noticed the problem on the morning of the 7th day. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and they'd ventured out to assess damage to crops and structures. They found the grave site transformed. The rocks had been moved by rushing water. The earth was carved away, gullied, and in one place, a section of the grave had collapsed inward, revealing the top of the wooden box, and the box was open. The lid had been displaced by the shifting earth. Through the gap, they could see. Inside, they could see Marcus Brennan's hand, thrust upward, fingers clawed. Still, they could see his face, turned toward the opening, mouth open in a scream that would never end, eyes wide, dirt caking his features, but it was his hand that would haunt them, the fingers, the way they'd torn at the wood, leaving deep scratches, the way the fingernails were gone, ripped away by desperate scrabbling, the way the hand was angled, as if in death he'd been trying one final time to claw his way out. One of the men who found him vomited immediately. Another ran back to town, pale and shaking. By afternoon, most of the town had seen, and something broke in Harrow's Creek. Sarah Hobbs appeared at the church on the 8th day. She entered during morning prayer, interrupting Reverend Kane mid-sermon. She walked down the center aisle, and people parted before her like water before a stone. She was changed, thinner, her eyes hollowed out. Her hair hadn't been brushed in days. She stood before the congregation, and she spoke. I lied. 2 words, simple, devastating. The church fell into absolute silence. Marcus Brennan never forced himself on me. He never touched me wrongly. I invited him into my home, multiple times, when William was away. We had an understanding, a relationship. I thought, she stopped, swallowed, continued. I thought I loved him. I thought he might take me away from here. But then William came home earlier than expected one time, and he noticed something. I don't know what. Something in how I behaved. Something different. He questioned me. He was suspicious. I got scared, so I told him Marcus had forced himself on me. I thought it would end there. I thought they'd run Marcus out of town, and I'd be safe, and that would be the end of it. She looked at Reverend Kane. I didn't know you'd kill him. I didn't know you'd do that. Silence, then chaos. William Hobbs was in the church. He lunged at his wife, screaming, fists raised. Men grabbed him, held him back. He was screaming that she'd made him a murderer, that she'd destroyed him, that she'd damned them all. Reverend Cain stood frozen, his Bible falling from his hands. Nathaniel Rooker looked like he'd been struck by lightning. Thomas Wickham sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking, and Sarah Hobbs just stood there, tears streaming down her face, saying over and over, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry." But sorry couldn't bring Marcus Brennan back. Sorry couldn't erase the sound of his screams. Sorry couldn't undo what Harrow's Creek had become. The town council tried to convene an emergency meeting that afternoon, but Thomas Wickham refused to attend. "I'm done," he said. "We murdered an innocent man. We tortured him to death based on a lie. And we did it because it was convenient, because it was easy, because he was an outsider and we wanted to believe he was guilty. I won't be part of this anymore." He left Harrow's Creek that night, took his wife and children, and disappeared into the mountains. No one in Harrow's Creek ever saw him again. The remaining council members struggled to maintain order, but authority, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. People started asking questions. If they'd been wrong about Marcus, what else had they been wrong about? How many other judgments had been unjust? How many other punishments had been excessive? And most troubling of all, if God had truly ordained what they did to Marcus Brennan, why had God sent the storm that revealed his suffering to them? Why had God forced them to see what they'd done? Reverend Cain tried to provide answers. He preached about tests of faith, about Job's trials, about how sometimes God's purposes were mysterious and required suffering to reveal truth. But his congregation was no longer listening. People stopped attending services. The church, which had been the center of community life, stood increasingly empty. But the real crisis wasn't theological. It was psychological. The people of Harrow's Creek began to hear things. Screaming, it started with a few individuals who claimed to hear it at night. A voice from beneath the earth crying out. They'd wake in cold sweats, convinced Marcus Brennan was still alive down there, still suffering. Their families dismissed it as guilt and imagination. But then more people began reporting the same experience. Men working in the fields would hear it, a distant cry, coming from no direction and every direction simultaneously. Women in their kitchens would hear it, faint but unmistakable. Children would hear it and ask their parents why the bad man was still screaming. The grave site itself became a place of horror. No one would go near it, but people claimed to see lights there at night. Pale, flickering lights that moved across the hillside like searching fingers. According to Clara Henshaw's diary, she went to the grave site 3 weeks after the burial. She wrote, "I had to see it for myself, had to know if the stories were true. I went at dusk, when the light was failing. The grave had been filled in again, properly this time, new earth, fresh rocks, but when I stood there, I swear I could feel something beneath my feet, a vibration, like someone pounding on the underside of the world. I ran. I've never been so terrified in my life. And that night, I dreamed of hands bursting up through my bedroom floor, clawing at me, pulling me down. I woke screaming. I haven't slept well since." The entire town was traumatized, collectively haunted by what they'd done and what they'd discovered they were capable of doing. By December of 1893, families were leaving. They'd pack their belongings in the night and disappear before dawn. No farewells, no forwarding information. Just gone. The general store began to run low on supplies because the peddlers stopped coming. Word had spread, somehow, about what happened in Harrow's Creek. Outsiders wanted nothing to do with a place where a man had been buried alive. By spring of 1894, the population had been cut in half. The church held its last service on Easter Sunday, 1894. Only 17 people attended. Reverend Cain preached about resurrection and redemption, but his voice was hollow, and his hands shook as he held the Bible. He would be dead within a year. Some said it was pneumonia. Others said it was guilt. He wasted away, refusing to eat, spending his final days writing in a journal that was later burned by his widow before anyone could read it. In the summer of 1894, officials from the Commonwealth of Kentucky finally arrived in Harrow's Creek. A circuit judge, accompanied by a federal marshal, responding to reports that had filtered out through departing residents. Reports of vigilante justice, of execution without trial, of torture. What they found was a ghost town. Fewer than 50 people remained. The general store was shuttered. The blacksmith's forge was cold. Cabins stood abandoned, doors hanging open, possessions left behind as if the occupants had fled from a plague. The judge conducted interviews with the remaining residents. He examined Thomas Wickham's records, which had been left behind in the church. He visited the grave site and saw the scratches inside the box, which had been preserved as evidence by some unknown person, possibly Wickham himself, before he fled. His report, filed in Frankfort, Kentucky's capital, on July 22, 1894, makes for grim reading. What occurred in Harrow's Creek represents a complete breakdown of civilized justice. A man was executed without proper trial, without legal representation, without appeals, using a method that constitutes torture under any definition. The community acted as judge, jury, and executioner, justifying their actions through religious doctrine that has no basis in law or scripture properly understood. Moreover, the victim appears to have been innocent of the charges for which he was killed. This is not frontier justice. This is barbarism. I recommend that the Commonwealth take immediate action to ensure that Harrow's Creek ceases to exist as an autonomous community. The Commonwealth's response was swift and unprecedented. Harrow's Creek was to be dissolved, legally erased. The settlement would be removed from official maps. The name would be stricken from county records. The town's charter, informal as it was, would be revoked. Any residents who remained would need to relocate to established communities where proper law enforcement existed. The land itself would be declared Commonwealth property, held in trust, unincorporated. Most controversially, anyone involved in the town council or in Marcus Brennan's execution would be prohibited from serving in any official capacity elsewhere in Kentucky. This decision was driven partly by justice, but equally by embarrassment. Kentucky was trying to shed its reputation as a lawless frontier. The Chicago World's Fair had showcased American progress. Kentucky wanted to be part of that modern world, not a reminder of its brutal past. Harrow's Creek was an embarrassment, so Harrow's Creek would be forgotten, the remaining residents scattered. Some went to established towns in eastern Kentucky. Others left the state entirely, carrying with them secrets they would never fully reveal. Silas Harrow died in 1895 in a poorhouse in Lexington, alone and unmourned. Nathaniel Rooker moved to Tennessee, changed his name, and refused to speak about his past for the remaining 3 years of his life. Elijah Sutter, the blacksmith who had proposed the method of execution, hanged himself in 1896. He left no note, but his daughter later said he'd been seeing Marcus Brennan in his dreams every night since the burial. Sarah Hobbs and her husband William divorced, an extremely rare occurrence in that era, and went their separate ways. Sarah ended up in Louisville working in a factory. She died in 1923, having never remarried. Her final words, spoken to a nurse, were reportedly, "Tell him I'm sorry. Tell Marcus I'm sorry." William Hobbs disappeared completely. No death record, no trail, just gone. The grave site itself became a point of controversy. The judge wanted Marcus Brennan's body exhumed and given proper burial in consecrated ground. But when workers went to retrieve the remains, they found the hillside had collapsed again during heavy rains. The box was gone, washed away by erosion, tumbled into the creek below, carried who knows where by flood waters. Marcus Brennan's body was never recovered. He remains, to this day, somewhere in that valley, his bones scattered by water and time, unmarked, unremembered except as a cautionary tale. The Commonwealth erected a small marker where his grave had been. It reads simply, Marcus Brennan, died October 14, 1893, victim of injustice. But that marker is long gone now, taken by erosion or vandals or the simple passage of years. Some readers might wonder, were any members of the town council ever prosecuted for murder? The answer is no. The legal reasoning was complex and cynical. Prosecuting them would have required a trial. A trial would have meant publicity. Publicity would have meant national attention to Kentucky's vigilante justice problem. And Kentucky wanted to avoid that at all costs. Moreover, the defense would have been simple. They were acting as legitimate authorities in a region where no other authority existed. They held a trial, heard testimony, rendered judgment. The method of execution was unusual, yes, but not explicitly forbidden by law, because no one had ever imagined the need to specifically forbid burying someone alive. The Commonwealth's lawyers determined that while what happened was morally reprehensible, securing murder convictions would be extremely difficult. So instead, they chose erasure, erase the town, scatter the participants, suppress the records, let time and silence do what justice could not. Today, if you drive through eastern Kentucky, you won't find Harrow's Creek on any map. The valley where it stood is marked as unincorporated land on official documents. The creek itself flows unnamed on modern GPS systems. The site where 200 people once lived has been reclaimed entirely by forest. Hikers occasionally stumble upon evidence of the old settlement, stone foundations of cabins slowly sinking into the earth, the remains of a road, barely visible as a depression in the forest floor. Once, in 1976, a Boy Scout troop found what appeared to be a collapsed well and the rusted frame of what might have been a church bell. But no markers indicate what happened there, no historical plaques, no tourist information, nothing. The Commonwealth kept its promise. Harrow's Creek has been erased. The story of Marcus Brennan's execution should have served as a warning, a demonstration of how quickly justice can become vengeance when proper safeguards are absent, how easily communities can convince themselves that atrocities are righteous acts, how dangerous it is to place absolute power in the hands of those who claim divine authority. But history suggests we don't learn such lessons as thoroughly as we might hope. Throughout the 20th century and into our own time, examples persist of communities taking justice into their own hands, of mob rule, of punishment that exceeds any reasonable definition of justice, of torture disguised as righteousness. The methods change, the justifications evolve, but the fundamental dynamic remains. Give a group of people enough authority, enough certainty in their righteousness, and enough isolation from outside oversight, and atrocities become possible. What happened in Harrow's Creek was extreme, but it was not, unfortunately, unique. Even now, 133 years later, questions remain about what really happened in that isolated valley. Was Sarah Hobbs truly lying when she recanted? Or was her initial accusation true, and her confession coerced by guilt over the method of execution? We'll never know. The only two people who could definitively answer that question are long dead. Some historians who have studied the fragmented records suggest a third possibility, that something did happen between Sarah and Marcus, something consensual that Sarah initially welcomed but later regretted, and that her accusation was neither wholly true nor wholly false, but something more complicated, a relationship that crossed boundaries she felt guilty about, that she then reframed as assault to preserve her marriage and social standing. This interpretation is, of course, speculation, but it highlights how justice requires not just hearing testimony, but weighing evidence, considering motivation, and acknowledging complexity. The town council of Harrow's Creek did none of these things. They wanted a simple narrative. Monster attacks innocent woman. Monster must be destroyed. They wanted certainty in an uncertain world. They wanted the emotional satisfaction of righteous punishment. And a man died because of it. No account of Harrow's Creek would be complete without addressing the hauntings. For decades after the town's dissolution, people reported strange phenomena in the valley. Hikers would hear screaming. Hunters would see lights. Some claimed to feel overwhelming dread in certain locations, a sensation so intense they'd flee without understanding why. In 1947, a geology survey team working in the area reported that their equipment malfunctioned repeatedly in one specific location. When they checked their maps, they discovered they were standing where Harrow's Creek had been. Their compasses spun wildly. Their radio crackled with what one worker described as sounds like someone crying for help, but far away. In 1969, a group of amateur ghost hunters attempted to spend a night in the valley. They lasted less than 4 hours before fleeing, claiming they'd heard someone pounding on the earth from below, screaming to be let out. Are these stories true, embellished, completely fabricated? It's impossible to say. What we can say is this: trauma has a way of lingering in places. Whether as literal ghosts or as psychic impressions, as collective memory or as suggestion, the horror of what happened in Harrow's Creek has refused to be buried as thoroughly as the Commonwealth might have hoped. The story of Harrow's Creek remained essentially unknown until 1967, when Clara Henshaw's diary was discovered by her grandson while cleaning out her house after her death. Clara had died at age 90, having never spoken publicly about her experiences, but she'd written about them extensively. Her diary covered 52 years, but the entries about Harrow's Creek, written between 1893 and 1895, were the most detailed and disturbing. Her grandson, a professor of American history, recognized their significance. He began investigating. He found Thomas Wickham's records, which had been stored in a courthouse basement in Frankfort, misfiled under miscellaneous, rather than properly catalogued. He tracked down descendants of other Harrow's Creek residents and conducted interviews. He published his findings in 1972 as an academic paper titled Frontier Justice and Its Discontents: The Case of Harrow's Creek, Kentucky. The paper caused a minor sensation in historical circles, but never penetrated popular consciousness. The story remained obscure, a footnote in a footnote, until now. Why does this story matter in 2026? Because the temptations that destroyed Harrow's Creek still exist. The temptation to bypass proper procedure when we're certain someone is guilty. The temptation to let our emotional reactions override our commitment to due process. The temptation to believe that some crimes are so heinous they justify any punishment. The temptation to trust authority figures who claim divine sanction for their decisions. The temptation to prioritize community cohesion over individual rights. Every time we hear calls to expedite justice, every time we hear arguments that certain people don't deserve the protections of law. Every time we hear religious or moral authority invoked to justify cruelty, every time we hear communities close ranks to protect their own vision of righteousness regardless of cost, we're hearing echoes of Harrow's Creek. The people who buried Marcus Brennan alive weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who convinced themselves they were doing the right thing. They were faithful to their religion. They loved their families. They worked hard. They would have described themselves as good people, and yet they committed an atrocity. This is what should haunt us most, not the supernatural elements of the story, but the human ones. The ease with which good people can do terrible things when they're convinced of their righteousness. Marcus Brennan has been dead for 133 years. His body was never properly recovered, never properly buried, never properly mourned. His story was suppressed for nearly 80 years. Even now, with the facts finally available, he remains largely unknown. A victim whose name appears in few history books, whose grave has no marker, whose suffering has been forgotten by all but a handful of scholars, and now you. Was he guilty of the crime for which he died? We'll never know with certainty. Sarah Hobbs said yes, then said no. The truth died with them, but here's what we do know with certainty. Marcus Brennan deserved a fair trial. He deserved legal representation. He deserved due process. He deserved a humane execution if execution was warranted. He received none of these things, and for that, an entire community paid with its existence. Justice, when perverted, destroys not just the innocent, but everyone it touches. If you ever find yourself in eastern Kentucky, driving through the mountains on winding roads that seem to lead nowhere, you might pass through a valley where the forest grows especially thick, where the silence feels heavier than it should, where the creek runs cold and clear over stones that might once have been foundations. You won't know you're passing through Harrow's Creek. There's nothing to tell you. But on certain nights, according to locals who still live in the surrounding hills, when the wind moves through the valley in just the right way, you can hear something that sounds almost like screaming, faint, distant, probably just the wind in the trees, probably, but probably isn't certainty, and uncertainty is what lingers when truth is buried alive. The story of Marcus Brennan and Harrow's Creek remains a disturbing reminder that justice and vengeance are separated by the thinnest of lines, and that crossing that line can destroy not just individuals but entire communities. That certainty, especially certainty wrapped in righteousness, is one of humanity's most dangerous impulses. But questions remain, questions that haunt these mountains still. Was Marcus Brennan truly innocent? What really happened between him and Sarah Hobbs? Where are his remains? And why, after more than a century, do people still report strange phenomena in that forgotten valley? To this day, the Commonwealth of Kentucky has never officially acknowledged what happened in Harrow's Creek. The records remain sealed or scattered, the land remains unincorporated, and the story remains largely untold. And on silent nights, when the wind moves through those eastern Kentucky valleys, when the fog settles thick between the mountains and the old creek runs cold over forgotten stones, some people still report hearing something that might be the wind, or might be something else, the screams of a man buried alive, echoing across more than a century, a reminder that the past is never truly buried, and that justice delayed or denied is not justice at all. If this journey through one of America's darkest examples of vigilante justice resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the thin line between righteous judgment and cruel vengeance, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, uncomfortable truths that history has tried to forget. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, if it made you question how quickly justice can become tyranny when proper safeguards are absent. And comment, sharing your own perspectives. Where is the line between community justice and mob rule? How do we balance the need for punishment with the requirement for humanity? What responsibility do we bear for atrocities committed in the name of righteousness? Until next time, remember, the most terrifying monsters are not those we imagine in darkness, but those we become when we're certain we're right. This has been the Untold Hour,